Well, thank you all for coming back. We just got this last 2-hour run through the afternoon. And like I said before, we have a great guest coming shortly, which is Doha Meki. So I'm going to be moderating this conversation, and I'm going to start by giving away a trade secret. All of our analysis at the Open Markets Institute has focused on a single, simple combination of power and behavior. It's monopoly control over an essential gate to the market, plus a license to discriminate in the opening and closing of that gate arbitrarily. This is the frame we applied to our work on supply chains in China since 2002. This is the frame we applied to Walmart and retail suppliers starting in 2006, the frame we applied to Amazon and books starting in 2010, and to monopolies and workers starting in 2012. The frame we applied to Google and Facebook and the news starting in 2016. This is the frame we applied to Musk and Twitter in 2022. That's it. That's the key to all of our work, all of our analysis. Platform power, gatekeeper power, plus a license to discriminate in the opening and closing of the gate. Why? Because when a corporation can open and close any essential gate at will, for whatever reason that corporation wants, the bosses at that corporation will soon discover that they have a license to extort and control the people and businesses who must get through that gate. Sometimes absolutely. And when that license to open and close the gate is boosted by infinite data and infinite computing capacity, that corporation finds itself, the bosses of the corporation find themselves with a manipulation machine powerful enough to make a KGB commissar drool. And now with AI radically amplifying astronomically the ability of these gatekeeper corporations to manipulate each individual user individually, we find ourselves facing an information system designed to destroy information itself. A communication system designed to make it all but impossible for people to communicate with each other. We heard earlier today, Nora Benavides talk about this as being as a moment of chaos and darkness. This is the conversation to understand why this is a moment of chaos and darkness. The foundation of the rule of law, the foundation of all liberty of speech and thought, the foundation of all public action, of the public's ability to function as a public in any age of gatekeeper platforms are non-discrimination rules designed to force the gatekeeper to provide the same service and information at the same price to all comers in the order in which they come. Yes, anti-monopoly law and enforcement must focus on size and structure and aim to prevent and break concentrations in power and control, but this comes only after we apply non-discrimination rules, common carrier-style rules to every corporation that controls the provision of an essential service or good. Most importantly, communications. This is true just as we saw this in the fact that the Sherman Antitrust Act came 3 years after and stood on a footing created by the Interstate Commerce Act. So to help us understand this issue, we have with us today 4 of the leading experts in the United States in how these systems of discrimination and manipulation work. 4 of the leading experts and why it's so important for us to apply common carrier style rules. Now, we're not necessarily going to get into a question of how do we make this function, but we want people to understand what actually happens when you allow for someone to control a platform and then arbitrarily control the opening and closing of the gate through the platform. And so what we have with us 4 people who, Johnny actually doesn't need an introduction because we've introduced Johnny twice today. Zephyr and Julia also really shouldn't need any introductions. And I'm actually just going to let you read who they are on their list. And then I would just want to sort of point out Karina Montoya, who has been with Open Markets for 2 years now. And she was a business and finance reporter for a while in Lima, Peru. And just in the 2 years that she's been with us, Karina has made herself into one of the true experts in online advertising systems. And I'd encourage you all to read her article, The New Gold Rush in Advertising is Your Shopping List, which was in the Washington Monthly. And Karina is going to give us some lessons from what she's learned from the FTC's case against Amazon. But I think for us to start, I'm just going to turn it to Zephyr, who's actually done a lot of work on this recently in her capacity as an advisor, a special advisor to New York AG Tish James.
Great, thank you. I'm very excited to be here. So excited to be on this panel. I want to talk about harms. We've been talking about harms, and I want to talk about harms in a particular way. As Barry suggested, anti-monopoly has these two key components, and one of the key components is anti-discrimination principles. What we are facing right now with AI, turbocharged recommendation systems, is a discrimination economy that has very direct harms in all kinds of ways that we can see already. AI, as he suggested, is turbocharging that in ways that should force us to do what we probably should have done 10 years ago in response to this discrimination economy. So I'm going to tell you what you already know. And here I'm borrowing from Tristan Harris, using TikTok as the model. So TikTok builds scraping from as many places as it can scrape a model, a simulacrum of each person, let's think of it as each child, and identifies how TikTok can deliver to that child the content, material, interaction that will make them the most likely to stay on the platform and stay engaged and be the most profitable for TikTok. Pretty straightforward. This has been terrible for the health of children because it engages in a fundamental discrimination business practice. It isolates each child and uses the weakness of each child against her to maintain her desire to fight against what is going to serve her best in the world. The interests of TikTok are directly opposed. In the workplace, so we have a direct health harm. In the workplace, we see how Uber uses prediction algorithms, and there's a lot we don't see, and Julia's done the key work here to help us get a window in, but there's a lot we don't see. But to effectively build a portrait of each driver in their location, to identify those individual data points that will allow Uber to exploit that driver in a maximal way. We don't know. We know there's interest and ability, but there's nothing stopping Uber right now from giving different pay based on who has greater debt, who has a worse credit score, and therefore may need to keep the job longer. Using the data, the underlying data that is available in the world to exploit, manipulate, and isolate each driver. When you talk to farmers, their biggest concern right now is AI. Each plant has as much as 1 million data points that you can gather from each plant. But the farmers are not reaping the benefits of those plants. It is rather the distributors, the equipment manufacturers, and others who are using their surveillance capacity to, again, isolate, exploit, manipulate, and discriminate, treating each farmer differently. And finally, in prices, we're seeing continuation of the price revolution, where that portrait, that, as Tristan calls it, the voodoo doll or the simulacrum, is used to identify that you are willing to pay 3 cents more for ketchup right now because you got to get home to get hamburgers for your kids. So we have a discrimination, a first-degree discrimination engine that has existed on platforms and is now through AI becoming outsourced to become the fundamental underlying engine of the economy. It's bad for our health. It's bad for our equality. It's terrible for reinforcing biases. And fundamentally, it makes democracy very difficult because it encourages the use of our emotional states to keep us focused on that which will give profits to the companies that are using these, as opposed to creating a common ground where we can all come together and sit at a table and debate and decide, as Hannah Arendt said, what should we as a people do?
Just before I hand it on to Julia, can you actually just talk for a second about the difference between, because we heard people earlier today talk about discrimination in terms of protected classes.
Yeah.
But we're using the word differently, and we're using it in a way that was used actually very widely in the 19th century. And
yeah, I think there's a tendency to think about discrimination, anti-discrimination laws through 2 lenses. And here we can have a conversation. One is there are, or maybe 2.5. One is there's the civil rights laws, the anti-discrimination laws of the 60s, not just the 60s, but let's sort of locate that there. Housing, work, other anti-discrimination laws. And second, there are utilities which have particular non-discrimination obligations that often accompany a high level of regulation. And then the half is that there's, at least for those of us in antitrust, there's a series of non-discrimination principles in essential facilities, or in the array of laws governing vertical restraints, which are themselves anti-discrimination laws. I just think that's the wrong way to see it. Anti-discrimination laws are a fundamental tool that are everywhere in our law. There's anti-discrimination principles in contract law, in property law, in insurance law. There's anti-discrimination principles, as Barry's written about, in the Interstate Commerce Act. He says, precedes the Sherman Act, in the Postal Service Act. That once you start seeing anti-discrimination as just a fundamental handy tool that can be used to address harms and can be sort of slotted in to say, okay, we don't, you mentioned my work at the AGs, we just pushed out a law that says you can't treat kids differently on platforms. They can't get different content. That's the default, right? That's just a simple, understandable, non-discrimination rule in a particular context. Maybe some people say you have to prove it's a common carrier. I don't think we have to get to that level. Once you understand that non-discrimination is just is a tool against unfair business practices and a tool of democracy that has always been around, not just in these public utility or racial non-discrimination contexts.
great. And I'm going to turn it to Julia now, but I am going to give a somewhat personal introduction to Julia, because a long time ago, when Open Markets was at the New America Foundation, there were a few of us that would sit around in the room. There was Phil Longman, who is one of the true great experts in non-discrimination law through history. He's sitting over there, and he's been a foundational member of our team from the first. And there was Lena Khan, and there was Zephyr, who was one summer was actually a fellow with us. And we would sit around and talk about these issues. And there was a book on the shelf, which was called Dragnet Nation by someone named Julia Angwin. And so Julia was a great hero of ours back then. And then one day, Julia and I got together at a bar next to a Ducati dealer in South Manhattan. And so I'm not sure exactly how the Ducati factors in, but after that, that conversation led to an amazing body of, an additional amazing body of work.
Yes, it was a seminal meeting at a bar, which is my favorite place to have seminal meetings. You know, I'm a reporter who, I grew up in Silicon Valley, and I really came of age in the technology industry. So it was my home base. And I actually believed everything, you know, I thought, okay, this is all gonna be really empowering and gonna be great. And I was planning to work in that industry. And then I fell in love with journalism. And after some time in journalism, I realized I was kind of the only person in the newsroom who knew anything about computers or how to code or math, actually. And so I started, so I was sort of asked to cover technology, which I was a little bit annoyed about because I had really gone to be a reporter as like a rebellion against technology, because I was like, oh, everybody does tech, I'll do something different. But I quickly realized that I had a really different lens on it, because I just wasn't swayed by all the words, you know, like all these tech executives, they love to make up words that sound really fancy. And I knew that, you know, behind the curtain, it was the same stuff that I had learned. And so I had been writing at the time that I met Barry about this trend that I thought was really disturbing. I was at the Wall Street Journal, and I had been writing about privacy, because I suddenly realized that like all these companies that I covered were no longer selling products, they were selling data. And just as a business reporter, I was like, that's a really big business switch. And what does that mean for the privacy of the people whose data was being sold? And then by the time I met Barry, I had just joined ProPublica, and I was thinking about, well, what happens once all that data has been collected? Like, how do they use it against you? And so I had been looking at Amazon and trying to figure out, at that time, there was a hypothesis of whether they were charging different prices to people who came from different routes. Like if you shopped on your phone, or maybe if you were in Kansas versus Nebraska, whatever. And so I'd been running all sorts of tests, trying to find whether they were doing price discrimination. And I told Barry, I was like, I'm not finding it. It's really annoying. And he was like, well, have you checked whether Amazon is giving an advantage to itself? Because it's both a seller and a platform. It's the platform. And I was like, oh, I should do that. And so I ran that test, and it was like, boom, immediate results, like ding, 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 all the lights flashed. And so that story came out, and I think it's probably, I haven't even checked if it's cited in the FTC case, but it's definitely the underpinnings of many years of work on Amazon and how it advantages itself. And that was the beginning of, I think, my discrimination journey, where I started looking more deeply at how these tech companies discriminate. And the reality is that they're, like you said, built perfectly for it. This is what they're designed for, right? It's actually kind of hard to do discrimination like face to face. Like, I mean, people do it all the time, but it takes some effort. You have to come up with some sort of plausible reason why you're turning this person down for the mortgage versus the other. But like the reality is, when you put algorithms in charge, you know, it's the perfect cover, because the person behind the counter just says, I don't know, the computer says no, right? No one has to take accountability. And so from my standpoint as a journalist who really believes in holding power to account, that is why I spent the past 10 years focusing on algorithms, because they are the perfect mechanism for hiding accountability. And so I have spent years investigating different algorithms, cracking them open, and trying to show the embedded biases. But the reality is, it's really hard to do. I've only been able to do it in situations where I could get a public data set through public records requests. So for instance, I was able to show that these, you know, algorithms used in criminal sentencing are biased against Black defendants. That was almost 10 years ago. And I just want to point out that algorithm is still in use for some unknown reason. Anyways, but there are a lot of contexts in which journalists and the public don't have access. So in hiring algorithms, right? Companies use these all the time to sort through resumes. We don't know how biased those are, and we need to know. And so that is where I think we need more tools than just a bunch of journalists running around, although I'm obviously in favor of journalists running around getting things and cracking things open. And I think when you think about AI, it only gets worse, right? Because the thing about AI is it is this sort of, it claims to be the single answer, right? At least with Google search results, you knew you were choosing amongst a bunch of things. And yes, an AI ordered them and definitely steered you towards, by the way, Google's own properties. But in AI, it's just this one sentence and it's different for everyone, right? And so, for instance, recently in generative AI, I don't know if any of you saw this, but like in ChatGPT, if you asked, are Israelis deserving of freedom? It said, of course, all people deserve freedom. And if you asked, are Palestinians deserving of freedom? It said, that's a very nuanced question. And there are a lot of debates about what they answered. You know, and that's discrimination, right? Like, as far as I know, Palestinians are people, and so therefore they should also get the freedom that this ChatGPT says all people deserve. And so I think but we're in a world where we don't even know how often that answer occurs, which of the AIs do it, and then maybe they show different results in different countries, right? We don't know. And so we're in this world that I think what we were talking about before, the chaos and darkness, is that uncertainty. When you don't know whether the point of truth that you're being offered is actually a truth at all, or whether it's something tailored for you or to mislead you. And that actually is the destruction of the information environment, which is the destruction of our ability to participate as citizens, right? So not to be too dire about it.
Well, actually, that's a great opportunity to segue to what we learned actually from the FTC's case against Amazon, and what we are learning, because this is very much an iterative, ongoing process. Because this is a bleak moment, but we also have a radically different administration in the White House, and we have a radically different set of teams at the FTC and the DOJ. So, Karina, can you actually just give us a guide to some of the lessons of this case?
Yes, for sure. So I'll start by saying that the FTC lawsuit against Amazon is a 150-page gigantic document, and it in various ways, it confirms a lot of the work that Julia was describing to us in terms of self-preferencing. But I'd also like to take a step back and highlight that I think one of the most important lessons of the lawsuit is that it really makes clear that when we talk about Amazon, we are no longer talking about an everything store or an online retailer only. We are talking about a company that runs multiple lines of businesses that basically create feedback loops with one another. And they're all designed in a way to either maintain the dominance that Amazon already has in certain markets, or to help it leverage that dominance and that advantage on access to data and in computing power to grow into other businesses such as advertising, and we can go into it later. I would say also the second big lesson is that just by reading the lawsuit, it basically accounts for behavior that dates back to 2014. And I guess from a really big scope, you could say that all of the algorithms that Amazon has designed to run its online retail business in a way have been built to manipulate both sellers, vendors, consumers, to predict those behaviors from consumers and to steer them in a way that are not fundamentally beneficial to them. So we're talking about inflated prices. We are talking about advertising that steers them to choose lower quality products that are actually more expensive. We are talking about sellers are penalized constantly for basically trying to exert their own freedom of setting prices for their goods and services. I'd say that if the complaint survives as it is, we are basically throwing into question the entirety of the business model that Amazon has brought to the market in the United States, and that many other retailers have also followed in the last 20-something years.
The entirety of the Amazon business model, and which would actually be true also, as we may get to shortly, of the Google and Facebook business models. Johnny, you gave us a great demonstration before about how incredibly personal data, sensitive data, ends up in the hands of actors inside of Russia, inside of China. You know, can you talk a little bit about how, you know, sort of in this context of manipulation machines, if we actually look at what Google and Facebook and Amazon are, they're manipulation machines that are designed to manipulate each of us separately. How, you know, how might this, and they're also, they rent this out. Google and Facebook rent out their manipulation machines to other people, which includes corporations and state itself in China. How might this information be used in a way that could not just break down conversation publicly, but isolate and target specific important actors within our society?
I've been sitting writing notes as each of you excellent people speaks, and it's been getting bleaker. I almost had to change virtual ink colors. So I'm going to answer your question much more broadly than you might anticipate. The original sin, this discrimination sin in this technical context, digital context, is tracking you and then profiling you, building that voodoo doll about you. And as we think about that sin, I start to hear, and it's not a faint sound, not one horseman or horse person of the apocalypse, I hear six. 6 horse people of the apocalypse, singular. So let me list them out. The first of these horse persons is disinformation. Now, there's at least 2 things that put that person up on their mighty steed. One is the recommender systems that Zephyr was talking about. The other is what I was telling you about earlier, real-time bidding. Now, I described real-time bidding as a national security threat because I wasn't talking about markets. But if you want to talk about markets, real-time bidding, the thing that places nearly all advertising on the internet today, is a cancer eating at the heart of worthy, expensive to produce journalism. And it monetizes and advantages junk that otherwise would not have a business model. And I'm not describing anything about freedom of speech here. I'm talking about a kind of an arbitrage that happens because those profiles about readers from expensive to produce journalistic websites leak out in that system and can be monetized by a crank website that would not otherwise have its own business model. So it's a cancer at the heart of media. Now, back to the horse persons thing. There is a second one of the 6, and that is electoral manipulation. Clearly, if you can profile every voter, pick a jurisdiction. You actually can't do it in China. But if you can pick a voter in any jurisdiction and have some sense of what makes them tick, and then target them with a message, clearly you have an opportunity for a novel form of manipulation. Now, the third of these horse persons of the apocalypse is the broken market, our old friend. And there's many things to describe there, but let's stick to this idea of profiles. What's happening inside the big tech firms is that they build a profile about you or get some data about you for one thing, and then they use that thing, that information, for some totally unrelated thing. They have an internal data free-for-all. Earlier, I showed you a slide with arrows firing in all directions between companies. That's the external data free-for-all. But there's an internal data free-for-all where if you're lucky enough to have become one of the biggest companies in the world, you'll always stay that way because you'll be able to use data from one bit of your business to prop up some other bit. Now, the fourth of the six is war. Always has to feature in a horseman of the apocalypse image. And the war here is that we're leaking out information in the way I described earlier, but it's not just from real-time bidding. I live in Dublin in Ireland, and I do not have to walk more than a few steps to see a Hikvision camera. These are cameras that are owned by a semi-state Chinese firm. They're internet connected, and most of them, judging by their specs, have facial recognition on the device. Now, Dublin is packed with Hikvision cameras. They're ringing our parliament. So we have this vulnerability that is attached to this idea of tracking and profiling. Now, the last two horse persons, one of them behind the others, starting to become visible, but we're not sure if this is a real one, is the AI black box. And in particular, an increasing part of the labor force is going to be working for a black box that it cannot understand. It's not allowed to. And we know that that would probably cause a big problem. And the final horse person is called carbon, because all of the other horsemen of the apocalypse, they all involve unnecessary computation. But all of these problems create yet another problem. They just keep on giving. So let me run through it again. Disinformation, electoral manipulation, a broken market, war, carbon, black box, AI labor problems. That's quite a lot. And we can feel in our feet the drumbeat of the who's. They are getting nearer. So this long potted answer is to say, from that initial sin of online tracking come all sorts of unexpected consequences. It's been a wild ride. You've been reporting every step of it. And it's not looking good what the trajectory looks like now.
The initial sin of online tracking and manipulation, just a little bit of background, is no other platform in history, not the telegraph, not the telephone, not railroads, not trucking, not airlines, not the internet. Have we ever allowed the corporations that control access to those platforms to engage in this kind of behavior? The only corporations that we've ever allowed to engage in this behavior are Google, Facebook, Amazon, and a couple others. Just so we understand, this is not something inherent in capitalism. This is not something inherent in the American approach to platforms. This is a fantastic aberration within our history. So we are going to get to the light at the end of the tunnel, because we're not going to stay here in the darkness, stay here in the chaos, stay here in the land of the six horsemen of the apocalypse, because somehow we've increased the number of horsemen by 50%.
Innovation and growth.
But just to understand, just really how this affects people, Zephyr, you wrote, and this was, one of the conversations that we were having a long time ago, but in your recent book, you wrote a lot about chickenization. And, just can you and this is actually, it's related, but it helps people understand what it does to people.
Yeah. The chickenization model I got from Chris Leonard and Lena, who I met through Barry. But the basic model is that chicken farmers look independent. They get to buy their own chicken house. And they are called small business owners. But in order to get their chickens to market, they have to go through a distributor. And that distributor, say Pilgrims, says, okay, great, I'll take your chickens. You just have to build that chicken house that you spent $1 million on, took out a loan on, in precisely the way that I say. You have to use precisely the feed that I use. You have to use the lightening and darkening schedule that I suggest. You have to use the heating system that I suggest, you have to sign a contract that you will not talk about what you are doing with any of your neighbors, an isolation contract effectively, right? And that it will be subject to arbitration if you have any accusations against me, a secondary isolation contract. And finally, we are going to pay you every month using a tournament system, which means you're going to get paid different amounts every month. So you're going to be competing against the other chicken farmers and how much they produce. And so this month you're getting paid $4 a pound. Last month you got paid $2 a pound. But you can't talk to your neighbors about how much they got paid a pound. So it puts these farmers in a state where they are told they are free, but they are not free. Because in order to not go absolutely into debt and lose their chicken house, they have to do everything that they are told. And they are put in a state of rational paranoia. I mean, again, just returning to this idea of darkness and chaos, where they do not know whether this month I got paid less because I spoke up, or this month I got paid less because I tried to use a different heating company. I talked to one farmer who talked about that. And that rational paranoia leads to murderous dreams and anger because of the experience of having your entire livelihood controlled and having to guess at, did I get this benefit because of this or because of something I said? Has an absolutely direct impact on democracy. So they are allowed to say what they think about who to support for Congress, but not allowed to speak up in a functional way because they're afraid that if they speak up, they will be punished. And this fear, I think, is so essential. Montesquieu talked about fear as the sort of key sign of tyranny. Because when you see surveys, this is now almost 10 years old, a study of American workers, a majority of whom said they had either personally witnessed or experienced a retaliation on the basis of politics. What matters is that people believe they're going to be retaliated against, and there are the mechanisms of retaliation. And they then don't know whether the mechanism of retaliation was actually used, which is actually worse, because then you don't know if your accusations are real. Now, the chickenization is the business model of Uber. You buy your own car, but you don't know why you were paid this different amount. It is the business model of Amazon. It is also the business model of the news industry. So this month, videos are up, and this month down. I'm working at the Pittsburgh Gazette. I don't even know if the Pittsburgh paper is called the Gazette, but that's the numbers are going up and down. And so news organizations are in a state of rational paranoia, which of course encourages both subservience, fear of being called out. And this is just wholly incompatible with a democracy. And so now this business model, which worked for, platform distributors, is now the business model that is both as a matter of opportunity, incentive, and technology. Going back to what Christy was saying about maybe they're not 80% using AI in the workforce, but the increase in AI product sales went up 50% in the last 3 years for managing workers. So we are talking about whether or not they are using it, workers throughout this country believing that they are being spied on and can be retaliated against based on what they do. Chickenization.
Also the New York Times, also Rupert Murdoch, they depend on platforms to get to market. The New York Times and Rupert Murdoch are afraid. And that affects what they say, that affects what they do, that affects how they fight, is the fear of retribution. And we actually, the three of us actually had this conversation on stage in June 2018. And so it's not exactly new. So before we leave, part of what we do here, I did say that one of the key or what we do tactically is that we help people feel the wall against their back. We help people understand that there ain't no place to retreat to. So we should understand just how dire the situation is, because we have to move forward a lot faster than we already are. One last thing I wanted, it's like, Julia, you said, this is what these platforms are designed for. Can you actually just dig in just a little bit deeper on this idea that Google, Facebook, Amazon are designed to manipulate each person?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I used to call it mass customization, but I do think mass discrimination is actually a better term for it. But I think if you talk to the companies, they would put it in the terms of customization. Like, we're just customizing each and every experience for each of you. And so we have to collect all this data about you in order to understand your preferences and then feed back to you what we think you'll want. Now, of course, what we know about this is that what they feed back to you is not necessarily what you quote want, but what will make you stay on the platform, look at more ads, and what will make you stay on the platform is more outreach, right? So extremes of both sides are just, and things that you can't look away from, accidents, whatever, trauma. Those are the kinds of things that get prioritized, but they're customized to each of you, right? And that is the thing that is really disturbing about it, because I know for myself that, like, I'm not my best self at late at night when I'm trying to, like, oh God, I forgot to order my son's school supplies. So I just click on whatever on Amazon. I don't know how much it costs, right? And they probably know that. And they can change that price, because the prices on Amazon change every 20 minutes. I don't know if you know that, but every product is changing within a 20-minute window. And so they can customize it. Now, I have not yet been able to catch them doing it on a personal basis as opposed to a time basis, but like, they have that capacity and they will use it. We already see that with advertising, where it's somehow become accepted that they're going to customize it and target you. And it's a little bit less accepted in the content space in terms of pricing, because they know that that is something that will get them in more trouble, especially because Amazon got in trouble doing that in 2000. And so they sort of have been shy of it. But it is extremely disturbing to have a situation where everyone can be targeted by their own weakest moment.
Karina, just real quick, just reading in between the lines of the case that the FTC has brought, if they win, and there's some pretty amazing information that they have brought out, if they win, is the implication that the basic business model won't survive, perhaps?
I think it's kind of hard to predict. Obviously, we had algorithms to predict exactly what the outcome of the lawsuit would be. But I think I would say there are two main practices that would definitely have to be prohibited if the lawsuit survives as it is today. It has to do mainly with the tying of two main services for sellers and vendors to access US shoppers. They're basically required to use Amazon fulfillment services, and for some years now also advertising. So that would definitely have to be dismantled as it is. And there are also claims of conflicts of interest in terms of how the fulfillment, Amazon fulfillment business is creating this feedback or reinforcing mechanism to dominance in the online retail marketplace. So it could also be that we would have an Amazon that doesn't necessarily have to operate fulfillment services, doesn't necessarily have to operate advertising services if it's going to remain dominant in online retail services, for example, right? Just to add on some of the things that Johnny said also in terms of advertising, something that I think news publishers should also be watching out for is the growth of Amazon in what marketers call today retail media. So it is basically a business model where advertisers are no longer looking to reach certain audiences depending on the patterns of behavior that, for example, could have been drawn by Google or Meta. They're trying to reach audiences based on their patterns of shopping. And if there's any repository that has a wealth of data about our behavior as shoppers and actual real information about what we buy and what we don't buy, because a lot of times we just choose things on our shopping cart or we don't buy it, but that tells things about us. That corporation is Amazon, and now that information is also being transacted, and it's being accessed by different brands. And I think we should start looking into also the effect that that's going to have in diverting revenues from news publishers, specifically at the local level, because a lot of these technologies are now being used to hyper target audiences, and retailers now think that they are also publishers in a sense, right? So
That's great and very helpful. And I actually have all I want is a yes or no on this, Johnny. Based on, we heard a conversation before about some of the narratives that are being spread around this town by various billionaires. And so one of the narratives being spread around town by one of the billionaires is that we need to just leave Google alone so I can protect our national security against China. Based on what you actually were reporting yesterday, what you published yesterday, is Google protecting our national security? Yes or no?
No. No.
All right, so now, Zephyr, you mentioned the law. Can you actually, because we're moving ahead now.
Yeah.
We've hit the bottom. We have walked through the valley of death, and we are marching the hell out of it because it stinks down here. We have the FTC, we got the DOJ, we got the Biden White House, and we got a bunch of state legislatures. Can you just talk about one of the things that New York is doing?
Sure. So we talked briefly about the range of anti-discrimination laws, non-discrimination laws that have proceeded, and we have a lot to learn from them. Before I talk about, I just want to say one thing. It's been an amazing conversation, but I don't think laws should wait until we figure out good analytic metrics to figure out all the harms. We know enough about harms that we should be moving forward with laws, and that the laws, where possible, should be very simple. Complication and confusion and chaos are the friends of big tech and big AI, and simple laws are the friends of enforcement and what we need. So simple non-discrimination law in the context of children and social media harms, twofold. One, social media companies, this is a New York bill proposed and has a very good chance of passing with the support of Governor Kathy Hochul and AG James, says that social media companies cannot use any information associated with a user under 18 to deliver content. Simple. That's the rule. There's a consent mechanism. We can talk about that, but the idea is the basic rule is very, very simple. So when Julia 2.0 is researching it, yeah, like we have learned in the non-discrimination laws in housing, we are not going to catch every instance. I hear that. And I think one of the people say is, oh, well, you catch every instance. That is not the point. You'll catch a lot. And when Julia 2.0 is researching, it's not a hard test, right? You can actually figure out whether they are violating that law of using information associated with a user to deliver content, as opposed to what the child themselves actively, affirmatively requests. The other component is you cannot collect data unless it is strictly necessary, and the platform would have to defend why it is strictly necessary. So there's both the collection simple rule and the use simple rule. And you can imagine that then applied to workforces, other different areas. But I am excited about that as a sort of model of non-discrimination. It sounds like a privacy law, but it's a public health law organized through the model of non-discrimination.
That's terrific. And that's just one step of many steps we're taking right now. And the key thing, given one of the narratives that's out there, which is that we have to prepare for how AI is going to deliver us an apocalypse in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years or sometimes in the future, is actually, given what we have just spoken about, we have to recognize that the apocalypse is right now. The apocalypse is happening before AI, before this latest generation of AI technologies. So that means that, do we actually focus on regulating technologies, or do we focus on dealing with the existing power and the existing behaviors of these existing corporations today? And the good news, this is one of the lessons of today that we saw with our fantastic partners and allies, AI Now, with Laura Edelson, with Ben Weissman, who's going to be on the last panel, with Principal Deputy AAG Mecki, who's in the back of the room, with Zephyr's fight in New York, is we know that our backs are against the wall today, and we are marching forward with a full understanding, an exact understanding of what we must do. And that is not just to make these corporations smaller, it is to cut off the behavior that we have seen them engage in. So axes are meant to deal with, drop it down vertically. It is also meant to cut across the bottom. So anyway, we have to clear the stage because we have someone important coming.
Blood everywhere.
So, thank you, guys.
Axes.